to meet those needs. And 3, determine how to pay for any selected solutions. And so there's really 4 major parts of the rule. It's broken up into the long-term planning reforms, a few other planning reforms that apply to both existing Order 1000 near-term processes and long-term processes, the cost allocation, and then as well as some planning reforms to local planning and right sizing. And so starting with the long-term regional transmission planning, the rule requires transmission providers to plan on a sufficiently long-term forward-looking basis, which the Commission found is at least 20 years. And the rule finds that a 20-year planning horizon will allow for the appropriate amount of time between when a transmission facility is identified to meet a future transmission need and when that need actually materializes, which allows for sufficient time in the interim to identify, plan, obtain any siting or permitting approvals for those projects, and then ultimately to construct the facilities. And we noted that some regions are already doing some planning on a longer basis. In particular, MISO, SPP, and New York ISO do already use a 20-year transmission planning horizon to some extent for some planning, but we found that this type of planning was not being universally conducted. And so to account for uncertainties that are inherently associated with a longer time horizon, we also tried to incorporate a series of tools and safeguards throughout the rule that are designed to avoid overbuilding transmission in response to any speculative transmission needs. And so one of the ways that we did that is through requiring specific type of scenario planning. And the rule requires that this long-term planning be conducted at least once every 5 years using a plausible and diverse set of at least 3 long-term scenarios and sensitivities that incorporate specific categories of factors and best available data inputs. So these sets of different scenarios are supposed to account for the uncertainty that there is when you're predicting the future and incorporating the different types of futures that may occur. The categories that the rule requires to be considered are laws affecting resource mix and demand, laws on decarbonization and electrification, state-approved integrated resource plans and expected supply obligations, trends in fuel costs and resource technologies, resource retirements, so which resources are leaving the system, generator interconnection requests and withdrawals, so which resources are expected to interconnect to the system, as well as policy goals and utility and corporate commitments. So we really tried to include the whole universe of factors that are affecting future transmission needs. And in response to comments, we also added in a new requirement, which was not in the notice of proposed rulemaking, for transmission providers to give a meaningful opportunity for stakeholder input into the factors that are used to develop those long-term scenarios. And we found that this will allow for states and other stakeholders to explain how their policies and planning affect long-term transmission needs. We also incorporated a requirement to analyze uncertain operational outcomes due to high impact, low frequency events to really account for the types of events we're seeing due to extreme weather. So using these long-term scenarios in planning, as I said, provides a tool for managing uncertainty, assessing the likelihood of each scenario coming to fruition, and reassessing and revising those scenarios every 5 years is also intended to address some of the uncertainty associated with a long-term planning horizon. So once you've done the planning scenarios, transmission providers are then required to apply 7 specific reliability and economic benefits to determine whether any of the identified proposals will efficiently and cost effectively address the transmission needs. And those 7 benefits are avoided or deferred reliability transmission projects and aging infrastructure replacement, reduced loss of load probability or reduced planning reserve margin, production cost savings, reduced transmission energy losses, reduced congestion due to transmission outages, mitigation of extreme weather events and unexpected system conditions, and capacity cost benefits from reduced peak energy losses. We also included an evaluation process that will include selection criteria for transmission providers to identify and evaluate these facilities. And we also adopted the requirement from the NOPR that transmission providers must consult with and seek support from relevant state entities within their region's footprint to develop these selection criteria. Going back to managing uncertainty, we also incorporated a requirement that in the event of delays or cost overruns, transmission providers must reevaluate the long-term facilities that were previously selected to make sure that they are still cost-effective solutions. Moving to the other regional reforms that we included that extend beyond the long-term planning, there's a requirement to consider in the existing near-term planning processes any transmission facilities that address interconnection-related needs that have been identified multiple times in the generator interconnection process, but that have not been built. And then there's also a requirement to consider in both near-term and long-term planning grid enhancing technologies, and specifically dynamic line ratings, advanced power flow control devices, advanced conductors, and transmission switching have to be considered as potential facilities to be selected. And moving on to the cost allocation, this part of the rule is probably the least prescriptive in order to give ultimate flexibility on this particular component. The only requirements we included here were that transmission providers must hold a 6-month engagement period with relevant state entities regarding the cost allocation methods before submitting their compliance plans, and that they must file 1 or more ex-ante long-term regional transmission cost allocation methods or a default cost allocation method in the tariff for transmission facilities or for portfolios of facilities. We also allowed that transmission providers can propose a state agreement process that lasts for up to 6 months after a project is selected for states to negotiate and transmission providers to file a cost allocation method. We did also include a requirement to allow states and interconnection customers the opportunity to voluntarily fund the cost of a facility or a portion of a facility that otherwise would not meet the selection criteria. So for example, if a particular facility did not meet the benefit cost ratio to be selected, but it was particularly important to a state or interconnection customer that this project be selected, they can choose to voluntarily fund the portion that will bring the project above the required threshold. And really the only standard or requirement that we included here for assessing cost allocation methods is what's already enshrined in court precedent, which is that they must be consistent with the beneficiary pays principle. So they must allocate costs in a manner that's at least roughly commensurate with the estimated benefits, and there shall be no allocation of costs to any entities that do not receive benefits or receive only trivial benefits. And then finally, the last portion of the rule includes some provisions to enhance transparency in the local planning process. There's a requirement to enhance transparency for local planning information, hold at least 3 stakeholder meetings per regional planning cycle to discuss the local planning process, a requirement to identify potential opportunities to right size. So looking at whether there are any facilities that could be built regionally that could more efficiently address a local need, and as well as providing a federal right of first refusal for transmission providers that develop any right-sized facility. So providing that incentive to build a facility regionally if it's the more efficient solution. And then finally, we revised the interregional transmission coordination processes to reflect the reforms that are in this rule and comply with information sharing and transparency requirements. So that is the general overview of the rule, and looking forward to the panel.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for being with us today and being willing to give us that short presentation. We're going to turn to our panelists. You guys will all turn on your cameras. What I'd like to do is offer each of our panelists the opportunity to make a 2-minute opening remark, a very general remark. You've only got 2 minutes, and it's first go around to kind of give some opening comments about your organization's perspective view on 1920, and then we'll get into, I've got a whole list of questions, so hopefully we'll be able to really delve into this. So, Chair French, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Corby and then David, if that's all right.
Sure. And so we've only got 2 minutes, so I'll be very general. And I'm not necessarily going to speak on behalf of the entire Kansas Corporation, but just for myself, because there might be varying views on our 3-member commission. But first of all, I want you to know I really did read this thing, and this is double spaced or double-sided printout. So I did read it. I will say, broad brushstrokes. This is a good rule. This is something that I think we all view that we need to be doing. We have some real-world examples over the last several years, particularly with extreme weather events, where our infrastructure and our build-out of infrastructure has probably not kept up with the demand and the needs of customers. And so it is probably better to be looking forward more. This isn't a rule that's about mandating specific outcomes. It's a rule that's telling our regions that you need to do an evaluation of what might be beneficial for customers, and then make a decision for yourselves based on your regional preferences of whether you build those facilities. And so, from my perspective, it's a good thing to be doing the evaluation. And I do think each region should do it very differently. I know my region in the central part of the country is going to make a very different evaluation, and is probably going to weight the benefits of different facilities very differently than other parts of the country. So I think the rule allows us to do that. There are bits and pieces of the rule that aren't exactly as I would have written them, but the pieces that are different, I think we have enough flexibility. I have made one observation, and I think, I have noticed that people's views on this rule tend to be somewhat tied to the level of trust they have in the planning authority in the region in which they sit. And if you feel that the planners in your area, so for me and Chair David, we have the Southwest Power Pool. If you feel like they've got a pretty good pulse on how you and your customers value transmission, and you trust them to implement this rule in a cost-effective way, I don't think Order 1920 is anything you worry about. I have heard from people in other regions that maybe don't feel like their regions don't value facilities the same way their customers do or their utilities do, and they've got concerns. So I will leave it there right now, but I think this is a good step forward and gives us a good framework to look at cost beneficial solutions for customers.
Oh, it's my
Perfect.
turn. Dear friend, here's my 10-page summary of the order that my great staff put together. So if you're nice, we can share it.
You'll be able to flip through it quicker than I will.
So ITC Holdings, we're the nation's largest independent owner and operator of transmission lines. We currently serve in 7 states. We have over 16,000 miles of transmission lines across a 90,000 square mile territory. And key is we're independent. So that means we're only focused on transmission infrastructure. So we do have a unique perspective in the industry. We are members of MISO and SPP as well. So, you know, we see Order 1920 as a positive step towards, you know, for forward-looking planning and building the grid of the future. And we definitely support FERC's decision to require this, you know, regular sort of forward-looking regional transmission planning that assigns costs and appropriately recognizes a full suite of benefits as well. You know, the rule comes at a great time. Many regions right now are predicting capacity shortfalls in the coming years due to tremendous load growth and the changing resource mix. So it's definitely a good time for this rule to have come out. Ultimately, though, you know, the compliance ball, it will be in the FERTOs. Each will have their own processes, and we do look forward to working with them once the compliance activity begins. But it's definitely going to take a little while for us to, you know, fully get there. In the long run, you know, we hope that Order 1920 will result in a build out, you know, lower bills for customers. You know, as we know, long-term regional projects provide a bunch of benefits, from relieving congestion to improving reliability, connecting more resources to the grid, you know, efficiently. I mean, the list goes on for all these regional benefits. And so I think this is it's really good for the transmission industry. And we see it definitely is a positive step.
Return. So thank you for having me. My name is David Springy. I am the Executive Director of the National Association of State Utility Consumer Advocates, NASUCA. For those of you that don't know, I assume most of the people that are probably on this do, but we're the consumer advocates, the state statutory consumer advocates, much in the same way that the states have statutorily created public utility commissions to regulate. They've created by statutes agencies that represent consumers within the processes related to investor-owned utilities across the state. I have 61 members operating in 45 states. So please take my comments as a general approximation of some of our concerns, because obviously we have members in each RTOs and members where there are not RTOs and members where there are trying to be RTOs. And, you know, so there's a lot of different sort of takes on what this FERC order may mean. I will say, you know, generally speaking, we support FERC's effort here. I mean, I think, you know, everyone recognizes that we really need to find a way to build big transmission projects, you know, for the reliability of the system, period, and then to accommodate a lot of different resources and growth going forward. So I don't think there's a lot of criticism that FERC took a swing at it, right? Good on FERC, they took a swing. You know, time will tell whether the swing works out or not. But you know, we do have sort of a set of concerns, you know, about this, and one is, you know, FERC had to take a swing because the current processes aren't working, but I'm not sure that we really addressed some of the fundamental incentive problems in the current structure of RTOs that are preventing them from working well. So I don't know that do we have a reasonable expectation that this whole brand new, very massive set of planning processes will actually work better than the ones that aren't working today, right? So I think you have issues of governance and independence and control and a lot of other things that really FERC just sort of walked away from and said, do this big thing. The other I think, concern that we have at the consumer advocate level is that over the last 20 to 25 years, we have taken things that used to be in the state control, and that consumer advocates had a strong statutory obligation and voice in, and we've moved them up to these regional organizations. And FERC, we have constantly for years and in this filing asked FERC to create a pathway and platform for us consumer advocates to have the resources to participate in these very, very resource intensive, big, strong, hard processes. And FERC just walks away from it every time. And in fact, not only in this process has FERC walked away from it, but there's a whole set of side, I'm sure people that follow FERC know there's a whole set of side dockets on transmission incentives and all sorts of other things that FERC hasn't issued any orders on either. So we're not feeling the warm and fuzzies, so to speak, from FERC about how this is going to work out. Again, I give FERC credit for taking the swing. I'm not maybe as optimistic as maybe Commissioner Clements and Chair Phillips are. I'm maybe not as unoptimistic as Commissioner Christie is, but I do think Commissioner Christie has some good points. So within that framework, I think the question is really, how do we operationalize? How do we make sure that consumer voices are heard? How do we make sure that the right things are happening? And how do we make sure, sort of under this new benefit structure, that we don't define benefits so widely that it is arguable that everybody benefits from everything, and therefore we can just socialize the cost? I mean, it's all good on paper until you try and actually actualize what those benefits and how we actually allocate costs and what that means. So those are some of our big concerns. Obviously, we'll go, talk a little more as we go forward.
Hey, I appreciate the concerns. You've brought some great things to light. Chairman French, Corby spoke a little bit about the fact, RTOs will operate differently. So can you give us kind of the perspective of SPP's view on this rule?
Yeah, sure. I don't know that I can speak for SPP, but I'm going to try to. I'm pretty involved in what they're doing in their planning processes and reforms underway, and a lot of that is going to address what's happening with Order 1920. So when this was a proposed rule and when it became final, I mean, I think SPP, MISO, they saw themselves as fairly well set up because they had already been pursuing some of these reforms. And I know Ms. Hertzfeld mentioned it. SPP does already have a long-term planning process with a 20-year time frame, but it's not quite as robust as what Order 1920 is asking for. It had less. It considered less scenarios in its planning process. It did not consider as many benefit metrics. I think it was on a 5-year cycle instead of what FERC is asking for now, which is a 3-year cycle. And probably the most important thing is SPP's 20-year process is more of an academic exercise, looking at what might be needed 20 years from now, but we didn't actually tell anybody to build projects out of it. Out of this new planning process, we will be directing projects. I do have some concerns about that. There are some provisions that might allow for projects to be reevaluated if they aren't needed as you get closer to starting to construct those projects. But don't have a giant issue with the idea of a 20-year planning process. I guess I would point out we've got transmission in my state that's 80, almost 100 years old. So you really do want to be trying to project out farther for what you're going to need in the long run, because that's the infrastructure you're going to be stuck with for a really long time. And so you want more optimal investments to be made for the long run. So as I mentioned, even without Order 1920, SPP was already moving forward with a strategic initiative to make its planning processes more holistic and forward-looking. And for those of you that are involved in the SPP stakeholder process, you may have heard about the consolidated planning process. So that would look out over a longer time frame, something like the 20 years being proposed here, and it would plan for all the traditional planning needs, reliability, economic needs, and it was going to bring in, or it is going to bring in, the needs associated with the generator interconnection process. And I'm sure everybody on this call has heard about all the problems with the generator interconnection queue and the backlogs and the inability to get resources online in a timely fashion. And that's part of what 1920 is about, and that's part of what SPP was trying to already solve for with this consolidated planning process. It's an innovative process. I think SPP is going to be the first one to propose something exactly like this. The focus now is, okay, Order 1920, I'm not going to say it's prescriptive because it does allow a lot of flexibility, but it is going to require you to incorporate a lot of things into your compliance plan. And so as SPP moves forward with its consolidated process and it wants to put that forward as its compliance plan, it's going to have a lot of boxes to check to show that it complies with Order 1920. And to the extent we want to do some things that are a little different, for example, the process we're envisioning is going to figure out a way to cost allocate some generator interconnection costs to the generators. That's not really contemplated in Order 1920, so we're going to have to explain, why that's a better and more fair approach. So for everything that's a little different, it's going to be a little bit of a lift, even though I do think SPP is better situated than a lot of regions, particularly the non-RTO regions, that are going to have to get their feet underneath themselves really quick. So, I do think we're in a good place for compliance, but SPP's approach will be unique, and we're going to rely on FERC to give us a little bit of leeway and say, look, you're doing things different, but that's not necessarily wrong. We think you're going to generally go in the direction that we want you to go in for Order 1920. So I'll leave it there. That's the SPP perspective.
Okay. So Corby, on long-term planning, when we're talking about long-term planning, ITC operates in both SPP and MISO. So can you kind of help provide a contrast how you all see each RTO's approach and how they differ when it comes to long-term planning and how this rule might affect that?
Yes, yes, we do operate in both RTOs, so we can, we've been looking at, okay, not to say which one's better or doing it better, but we do think, MISO has a bit of a head start than other regions when it comes to long-term regional planning. They have their current LRTP process, and that's been conducted voluntarily, and it seems to be largely compliant, subject to some tweaks, but it does seem to be largely compliant with Order 1920. MISO will have to obviously formalize a process or the process and, make it reoccurring at regular intervals. Currently the LRTP plans, will have to be updated, every 5 years as well, just to be compliant. But we do feel that MISO is almost there. I think they're in a better spot than SPP. And while SPP has invested in transmission over the years, we sort of haven't seen the same focus on backbone infrastructure build out that we feel is essential. So I think the last time they did any sort of portfolio based planning like MISO was when they did their balanced portfolio in 2009, which is Order 1000. But I know, as Commissioner French mentioned, they have a new consolidated planning process, the CPP, which from my understanding is expected to be revised a bit in order to meet the 1920 requirements. So, Order 1920 provides the floor, I would say, of reforms that are needed. Ultimately, the details will have to be hammered out in the compliance efforts by the RTOs, and some may do more, some may do less. But they are free to go above and beyond as long as they meet the minimum requirements. And then the compliance plans are going to be done as a result of compromise. So stakeholders will be involved in both RTOs, to come up with these compliance plans as well. So, that in itself will be, I think, difficult. We have so many different stakeholders representing different interests. So, it's kind of hard to say exactly how these compliance plans will end up, but I do think they'll get there, but it just may take a little while.
Okay, David, if you can kind of wrap this up with a broader perspective of this long-term planning. I can't hear you. Take it off of mute.
The mute button rules, right? So look, I try and be optimistic. Again, I get the general gist is yes, if we plan bigger and longer, ultimately we get rid of some inefficient things that are going to get built due to inefficient planning processes. That's all good. But again, when you start thinking about what sort of a planning process this is going to involve, just to get an agreement on the inputs. I mean, there's a whole set of FERC defined inputs that we all have to sit down and agree on. And so when they talk about a stakeholder process, what they mean is stakeholders that have enough money and time to be there. And everybody else, which is the vast majority of the population that ultimately pays the bills, don't have the money and time to be there. So again, there, on the one hand, you talk about transparency. On the other hand, this is going to be, I think, a fairly untransparent long-term process and a very complicated process to sort of take into account all the things that FERC wants to take into account. So let's not minimize I know that the RTOs like to suggest, well, we're kind of doing this already, right? Like it's close, we're close. But if we were doing this already, would FERC have written a, huge order like it did? I also think too, some of the real positive aspects of the FERC orders, requiring consideration of grid enhancing technologies. Because again, we know there are technologies that exist today that are cost beneficial and should be implemented, but for some reason, they never get implemented in the RTO process. So having FERC maybe put a little stronger glove on that, I think is positive for consumers. Because ultimately, aside from building long-term, we really need to maximize the use of what we have. Yes, and Commissioner French Chair French is right. There's some of our system that just needs to be replaced. It's old. That's a cost. But how do we maximize the use of what we got? The other comment I want to make about this, and this is a bigger concern. So the whole process it's talked about a planning process. In fact, FERC Order 1000 is very specifically a planning process. This is maybe something a little past a planning process, but ultimately a planning process. But what we know now is that there are utilities and RTOs that are in court that are arguing that once they have made a decision based on that planning process, is that states are preempted from changing that decision. So as an example, Chair French, since I, lived and worked in Kansas for a lot of years, I know the Kansas statute, unless it's changed recently, requires you to consider need and location when looking at transmission siting. You don't get to look at need anymore under this theory of the world. The RTO, you ceded that to the RTO. The RTO has decided what line is needed, and you now, even though you have a statute, you have been preempted. That's the argument in court. So that's concerning enough at sort of an Order 1000 pre-1920 sort of level. But when you start talking about these kind of massive, long-term, huge projects that will hopefully be spit out of this planning process, I mean, having kind of no idea what the legal implication of that result is, and whether or not, Commissioner French or Chair French, you no longer can comply with a Kansas statute, or you've, I guess, ceded that jurisdiction to SPP. Those kinds of questions, I think we need to be considerate of, because, again, when you're talking about a 20-year planning horizon that may designate a very big line and cost allocation for a lot of people over a lot of time, losing that state jurisdiction, and again, to Nasuka and my members, that is where we live, is certainly concerning, especially, as I mentioned, we don't really have an easy ramp or a lot of resources to participate in these considerations. So that legal piece is kind of huge.
I knew you were going to bring that up, David.
I'm glad he brought it up. I mean, I will tell you, David, that the states' rights still, that's a concern, I believe, for every state commissioner. So it will, and I hope we can touch on that as we go through some of this, especially when we get further down into some of the other questions. But my next question is for Chair French. The final rule puts an emphasis on increased state participation in cost allocation discussions. So why is it important to you as a state regulator, and does it go far enough? And then I'll let you, David Springy, kind of follow up from this.
Yeah, I mean, it is important because, look, you've got the planners out there, but they're not the payors. The retail ratepayers are within each of the states. And, for better or worse, I think it is the states that should be getting together and figuring this out. I've got a lot of respect for the RTO and their ability to plan the right facilities, but we should be the ones that decide what the value of those facilities are to our respective customers. So Order 1920, for me, this is kind of a non-answer. It doesn't really impact me because in the SPP region, SPP has already delegated primary authority for cost allocation to the state regulators. So we actually have 205 filing rights at FERC. Anytime there's a cost allocation decision, it goes to the regional state committee made up of all the states, and we take a vote, and whatever we approve, that gets filed at FERC. Now, SPP does have, their board does have a backstop authority. If the states can't agree on something, or if the SPP board, God forbid, decided that they could come up with a better cost allocation, they could file that as an alternative at FERC and let FERC decide which one is better. But we've already got more rights than what 1920 provides. I think it probably does provide more rights in other regions. Probably one concern or a couple things that are a little different is 1920 might actually put a clock on us to participate and come up with a cost allocation. I know they've talked about a 6-month clock to engage with the states. I would hope that that's not going to be strictly enforced against us because Commissioner David, you know how long some of these discussions can take in the stakeholder process. And I would hate to have FERC say, you guys are working on it, but you haven't come up with something. So we're just going to let the SPP board decide. So that is a concern. I think that's something I hope maybe on reconsideration, FERC might decide to give the states a bit more time, as long as we are engaging in good faith work to come up with a cost allocation. The other thing I would just say is, there is now FERC is going to ask us to look at more benefit metrics than maybe what we've normally looked at, and I think that's good. That's sort of the foundation of a cost allocation process. My feedback would be, let's keep those benefit metrics narrow enough to only focus on the ones that are kind of broadly accepted by all the stakeholders. But also, I like the line I've heard from some folks that you should have a broad enough set of benefits that everybody can kind of find something, or at least potentially find something that is of value to their customers. But my reading of Order 1920 isn't that we are in any way constrained on how we set cost allocation. I mean, it really still boils down to you've got to set a cost allocation that is roughly commensurate to the benefits that your customers receive. And I think that's what we'll do moving forward. The only other thing I will say about cost allocation, because I know there's been a lot of angst about this, is there has been sort of in other regions, this isn't necessarily important to SPP, I don't think, but there has been a view that that we should rely on a state agreement approach. And really what that's code for is every state should agree that they will not pay anything unless they specifically voluntarily accept to pay for that line for their customers. And I know it may not be popular with everybody, but I think that's untenable. I think when you are building, broad portfolios of projects that are going to benefit an entire region, which you have signed up to be part of, it is not acceptable for one state to just say, I'm not going to pay part of those costs. You go ahead and build the portfolio. We'll take the benefits, but we're going to opt out of being allocated any costs. At the end of the day, I think SPP has a good framework where it does require a majority vote of the RSC to approve a cost allocation. But if the states can't approve a cost allocation, if they all veto or opt out of being allocated any costs, I mean, there is a need for the region to have some sort of backstop authority to set a cost allocation. And again, FERC's going to have to to approve that on the basis that customers are allocated costs on a basis that's roughly commensurate. That's going to be subject to review in the federal appellate courts. So it's nothing to say anybody's ever going to be allocated costs that aren't commensurate with benefits. But I do think that the FERC order makes a good point, that you can't set up a framework that allows states just to individually opt out of being allocated costs. So those are roughly all my ideas on cost allocation. But I think in SPP, we're already going to have more cost allocation authority than even what 1920 is affording us.
So I'm going to say I mostly agree with Chair French and how he framed it. I think that the challenge on the cost allocation is going to come down to sort of what goes in the front part of the model. So part of the FERC criteria is state policy. So if you have a state that's got a very aggressive emission reduction policy or renewable policy sitting next door to a state that does not, what goes into the model at the front, I think, has to have some reasonable relation to what the cost allocation coming out of the back of the model is. Now, that may create an equally absurd incentive to not have any emission goals, because then you can, in theory, get out of cost allocation. But again, I think, my read is FERC was trying to be sensitive to that. But, at the end of the day, I think it's sort of illusory in a sense. Yes, roughly commensurate. I don't know what that means, but good luck. Maybe we'll find out in a post-Chevron world what that means by lots of litigation. We'll see. But the way I read it, whatever gets put on paper has to come with a default cost allocation, and so that's going to get set by whatever process is there. And every RTO's got a different process. Each RTO board is maybe more or less responsive to their stakeholder input in setting those, but ultimately there's going to be a default. And then FERC just said, hey, states, you got 6 months if you can come up with something different, which, I don't know if I'd be super optimistic about that, but, maybe it's a step farther than FERC used to go. But, states, for the most part, I think are still having input in the default processes within the RTO, however it's set up. Again, I'd make my normal complaint that we have a hard time playing there. So, the customers, as Chair French noted, the payors, who are mostly our customers, don't get to be there. And just as another plug, all of these processes cost money, and all of that money that everybody spends to pay, well, maybe not ITC, because they're sort of a separate independent entity, but the RTO costs, the commissioner costs, the utility costs, all that stuff gets flowed downhill and onto our bills too. So again, I don't know that the cost allocation piece changes much within the big picture. If we're really trying to be roughly commensurate, again, our bigger concern is if you sort of look at the framework writ large, it is designed as an everybody benefits from something, kind of as Chair French said, everybody benefits from something, so everybody can just pay. Well, maybe some people will agree with that. I know actually SPP for many years, I think, was it over 345 kV lines? They get socialized. That's just an agreement that was reached a long time ago. I know when I was practicing in Kansas, we were building a lot of transmission in Kansas, and Oklahoma was paying the cost. And I think more recently that sort of flipped. It's sort of, that was the arrangement that was reached in SPP. I don't think that's the arrangement anywhere else. So I think more focus on the inherent process at the RTO is the focus, and maybe less on whether states can get together in 6 months and agree on something, and whether there's a process, where we can come into that process, piece.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and ask one more general question, and then I'll get to Commissioner Harvey's question that he posted in the Q&A. So if anybody else has a question that they want to post there, please do that. So Harvey, Order 1920 walks back Order 1000 in a very limited way by creating a right of first refusal for certain right-size replacement transmission facilities. As an independent transmission owner, do you view this as a positive development, or what do you think this means for the future of ROFR?
Thank you. Yes, the right-sized ROFR to us is a positive development. It indicates to us that FERC is listening. And Order 1920 recognizes that Order 1000 is not working as it was intended to. The architect of Order 1000, former FERC Commissioner Wellinghoff, just recently said in an NPR broadcast the same thing, that it's not working like it was intended. So, and I am going to get on my soapbox. Competition to us, it's currently flawed. Competitive projects have exceeded cost expectations by 6 to 19% on average. And these long competitive solicitation processes, they take forever to get through. And it just causes delays in getting these projects built because you have to go through the whole process. So, it's no coincidence that most states in MISO have state ROFR, and that's where the largest, regional build out is occurring right now. So, while FERC did decline to act on the conditional ROFR as they originally had proposed in the proceeding, they did commit to exploring this policy in other proceedings. And so we're very hopeful that we can get this resolved once and for all in some of those proceedings.
Okay, so Commissioner Harvey with the Utah Commission is concerned about cost shifting under Order 1920. He says we do not currently have an RTO in the West, so long distance transmission must be financed by mutually agreeable arrangements. That would go out the window under Order 1920. This is one state of Utah asked for a rehearing and will file an appeal against the order. So can any of you guys comment on kind of what they're facing in Utah? Okay.
I feel like that's a question for me. I'll let the other two follow up, but that's right in the wheelhouse of the discussions taking place in Kansas as well. We definitely agree with the proposition that one state should not pay for the cost of another state to comply with its own, public policy goals or statutory goals. This is coming from a state that does not have a lot of clean energy goals. We've got a renewable energy standard we met a long time ago just because we've got a ton of wind in Kansas. But that's a concern for us. So, but I do have a few things to point out there. So first of all, Order 1920 does say that you should include those sorts of goals in your planning process, and you should consider facilities that might help people meet those goals. But there isn't anything in it that says that states without those goals should help pay for it. That's where the rubber meets the road when you get to the cost allocation process and the negotiations there. Definitely in my state, I don't know, I'm probably like Utah. I said that I would like to see a real emphasis in cost allocation on broadly accepted benefits. So for Kansas, the things we're going to be really focused on in a long-term planning process are, reduced energy costs. Are these facilities going to help us access lower cost energy? Are they going to firm up the grid and make things more reliable? Are they going to help us be more resilient in large-scale weather events? So, and where I'm going with this is a little different. A little different scenario, but I'm gonna talk about it maybe on the interregional scale because I'm talking to somebody from the West here. If SPP as it looks toward the West said, hey, it's making a lot of sense because of what our resource mix looks like, and they've got kind of a different resource mix in the West, and it makes sense to build more interconnections with the West, and it's gonna mean more resources are available to serve customers. There's all these resilience benefits. From my perspective as Kansas, I want to see all the data, but I can see a scenario where that could be really beneficial for customers from a reliability and resilience standpoint. At the same time, I can also see a scenario where all the wind, the glut of wind that Oklahoma and Kansas have in our western part of our states helps Colorado and other states meet their really robust clean energy goals. Now, it's tough. I don't think I would say well, you know what? Never mind. I'm not going to pay for any of those facilities because I'm helping Colorado meet their goals. Because at the same time, I'm getting the benefit of the resources and the diversity of resources that we're getting there. What it does boil down to is different people are going to see the benefit, or different states are going to see the benefits of infrastructure differently. If it works out to where you can all accept that the way that you cut things does provide a cost benefit to your customers, you're going to probably value it differently. I guarantee I will value it differently than Colorado does. But as long as we can see a cost benefit to our customers, then I don't know that it's my problem that somebody else is paying for it because it helps meet their public policy goals. So that's the way I look at it. I mean, I will admit that leaves a lot to the back end, to David's point. You got a lot of negotiation then on the back end, but I don't see anything inherently in Order 1920 that says that I will agree to a cost allocation, or that my region would ever enforce a cost allocation against me that makes my customers pay for another state's public policy goals. And maybe again that does boil down to whether I think my region has a pulse on what customers and PUCs in my region will accept.
Anybody else want to comment?
Phillips say a few times that, and paraphrasing here, that you're only going to pay if you benefit. And so I think that, a lot of people think that, I think there's a misconception with regional transmission that it only really benefits in the physical, like where it's physically located. But, these, as I mentioned before to us, I mean, there's so many benefits to regional transmission. And with the states being at the table to talk about cost allocation, whether you're in an RTO or not, I think you'll have a say in any sort of cost allocation discussions, because of Order 1920.
David, did you have anything else you want to add to that?
No, only that Michelle Beck, who's my Utah advocate, struggles with all these issues too, and really one of the interesting questions, just to sort of step back, one of the interesting questions happening in the West is, should we even join an RTO? Because again, for the state advocate level, like, wait, we lose a whole bunch of authority, jurisdiction, and ability to participate. Why would you join that thing? So the West is an interesting experiment in the first place. I don't have good answers for the commissioner from Utah on this, but I think he expresses the same concerns that everybody else has, right? So it's a matter of figuring it out.
And I will say, thank you all so much for joining us today, and Dr. Saikuda for allowing us to have this hot topic. There are several questions more that have been on the board that we didn't get to, so I'm hoping that in the upcoming FRI that we have, that maybe we can continue this discussion and really continue to answer some of the questions that we weren't able to get to today, because obviously by the number of people that logged on today, this is definitely a hot topic. And I think it will continue to be one in the future. So does anybody else have, Dr. Saikuda, do you have anything else you'd like to add today before we end?
No, I just regret that, we only have an hour because as you noted, there are a couple of other questions in the queue. I have a couple of questions.
And they're great questions, yes.
Yeah. And there's a lot to discuss, as you said. And I think there's really opportunity to have more conversation around this. FRI's Fall Symposium on September 28th is about building infrastructure and dealing with uncertainties, but a lot of it kind of implicates some of the issues in FERC Order 1920, and that is, as we're building infrastructure to deal with climate-related events, severe weather events, that seem to be becoming more common, how do we build in that resiliency and reliability and get it here in time, given the growth and demand load that we're experiencing across the country. So I know those are topics that we'll be talking about on September 18th at our annual Public Utility Symposium. You can find more information about that at fri.missouri.edu. We are still have registration open for that, and we have both in-person and hybrid or virtual opportunities there if you'd like to join us. I do want to thank all of our panelists today. Ms. Hersfeld, who's not online any longer, I don't think. David, Commissioner French, Harvey, Commissioner David, really appreciate you taking your time today to help us jump into this a little bit and at least start off a much longer conversation that I think we all need to have. So thank you for your time. For those of you that joined online, thank you for joining as well. We appreciate you being here, and we look forward to interacting with you down the road.
Right.
Best
Thank you.
wishes and have a great day.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Take care.